Welcome to In the Middle, a podcast on Christianity in the Middle East, where we explore questions of history, religion, culture, and policy that affects the ancient and indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Michael Wingert of Agora University and Dr. Sofia Mutlu-Numansen of the University of Twente in the Netherlands to look beyond the Sayfo. Sayfo, as many of you may know, refers to the Syriac Genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923. The word Sayfo literally means sword in the Syriac language, because that was the killing instrument of choice of the Ottomans. Over the last century, much has been written and discussed about the events of Sayfo itself. However, this conversation seeks to ask the next-level meta-questions that have presented themselves as a consequence of Sayfo in the diaspora a century later, including moral, psychological, philosophical, and national questions. So, without further ado, thanks for joining the conversation, and welcome to In the Middle. Dr. Wingert, Dr. Mutlu, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, it's great to have you with me. We've been trying to get together for some months now to discuss this topic about Sayfo. Obviously, with all of us in different time zones and actually in different continents. In fact, it's been kind of challenging, but here we are, and really it's exciting for me. I've really been looking forward to this conversation in particular, particularly because I am, of course, a descendant of Sayfo survivors, so it's personally meaningful. But more importantly, I hope to focus today's conversation on the century that's passed since Sayfo and consider some of the contemporary issues and questions that have presented themselves, including things like the psychological effects of persecution and genocide and their current manifestations, issues pertaining to the diaspora today and looking into the future, and such questions as those. As you know, and many in the audience may know or may not know, Sayfo was obviously a pivotal event in Syriac history. There's been a lot of examination of the event itself of Sayfo, but I think it's also critical to discuss some of the less discussed questions that have arisen as a consequence of Sayfo, even now a century later. So I look forward to doing that. But before jumping into the contemporary issues, I'd like to invite you, Dr. Mutlu, to please give our audience a brief background about what Sayfo is. What are we referring to when we refer to Sayfo?
When I refer to the Sayfo, I refer to the mass killings in the Ottoman Empire in 1915. And you can see it as broad as you would like. Actually, almost all Christian minorities were killed. So most people know the Armenian genocide. The Sayfo is actually in the same time, in the same area, but then we refer to the Sayfo as the Syriac Genocide, so for the Syriac people who were killed. And to me, it's not just simply the killings or the kidnapping, but it's also the aftermath of the Sayfo, what is very important, because we still do not have the recognition, not from Turkey and not from many other nations as well, that this was actually genocide. And that affects our people. And I think it's very interesting and also important to focus on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've heard a lot about the various genocides that occurred toward the end of the Ottoman Empire. Like you said, the Armenian genocide, the Greeks, and the Syriacs, of course. But yes, I mean, of course, the Syriac genocide, the Sayfo element of that is less heard, at least here in the United States. In Europe, there is some, I guess, greater conversation of that event as well. Shifting over to Dr. Wingert, I'd like to ask you, as a very close, figure or even member, I'd say, of the Syriac community here in the United States. We've known each other for some time. What's been your impression being a part of the Syriac community here in the diaspora of the community as they stand today, and what impact can you see, if any, and I'm sure you can, the Sayfo has that manifests today in your opinion?
That's a really interesting question, because there's so many layers to it, and one of the primary layers that maybe gets wrapped up in that is just the question of immigration. And so, some event, whatever it is, drives immigration. but maybe it drives successive waves after the event from secondary, regions or places like your line. Lebanon is the place of the secondary, or you first went to Lebanon and then from there to the United States. And so the question of being an immigrant is one, and then an immigrant maybe with some heavy history. And how does that heavy history manifest while being an immigrant, the sons or grandsons or granddaughters of these people who came and are trying to find maybe some stability, without all the other different questions we could ask about. I mean, the first one is stability, because I think anytime we get into a conversation like this where there's forced mobility, the key point is the instability it causes with a community, not just on the individual level, but within different communities. And I think it's something that all immigrants can relate to, because people are moving from one place to another for a reason. Maybe it's economic, right? Maybe it's a result of persecution. Maybe it's marriage, right? Like, there's all sorts of different reasons that cause people to shift from their norm, from their comfort zone to something new. And that's not universal. I mean, so a lot of the community from the Middle East lands in Europe, and Europe's quite diverse. Let's not, as much as it's happy EU time, it's not. I mean, there's different. Start with language, right? Like, the languages are different. Maybe they're cousins in some cases. All the Dutch people get to learn German, but the Germans don't really care to learn Dutch. So your cousins, like, you may have a secret language if you're from the Netherlands, and your German cousins from Gütersloh aren't going to understand what you're doing. The folks in Sweden, that's its own bit. And then you come to the United States or Canada, maybe even Australia, New Zealand. And although it's English speaking, okay, well, what about the subculture? What's it like for the community in LA, the community in Jersey, the communities outside those regions in places like Michigan or Chicago or uh, Florida, I guess, and maybe some of the lesser states, and not lesser because of any respect to them, but just like less immigration to those places like Indiana or North Carolina and things like that. There's all sorts of different layers to this, and I think what I've experienced with a lot of the young people today, and again, when I say young people, right, young people for Middle Easterners is different than people in the West, right? Young people, like the youth, you talk about the youth, that's like your elementary to junior high group. But youth for Middle Eastern people tends to mean like people who are finished with high school and, they aren't married, and depending on what the cultural norm is, can go to like 25 or 35, right? Like, we just like, that's one of the things that's being redefined too, is like, at what age do people get married? How do they find spouses when everybody is spread out? And before, you find a spouse the next village, because you have a business relationship, or your cousins, someone married from someone else. You can have that conversation in the Middle East in a local setting. Here, you have to have a convention where you go across one country or another, and little things like that people maybe in the West take for granted. Um, those are all part of building a stable core, a stable community, and maintaining community in diaspora it's a wild challenge. It really is.
Well, you put your finger on something really important. You mentioned up front the idea that those who migrated straight from the homeland, and that has a very broad definition, of course, straight to the West, right? My mother's side, for example, my mother's family came to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, so they didn't have that sort of first waypoint, as you say, whether it be Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine. But drawing that distinction, you have those who settled in these first wave countries in the region, Lebanon, Syria, and such. And then the second layer of here coming to the United States or Australia or Germany. So you have various identities, various cultures that sort of pile on top of each other or compound upon one another that broaden or exaggerate the disparity between people's identities, all of the same Syriac background, but a disparity of identity. For example, let's take the example of Armenians, who I really have a lot of admiration for. An Armenian from Lebanon or an Armenian from Jordan or Turkey or anywhere else is Armenian, and they'll tell you that even in the West when they're here in the United States. It's a bit different for the Syriacs here in the United States and possibly in Europe, but certainly here in the United States, where if I'm at as you mentioned, a convention or a gathering of other Syriac young people, um, some will identify as Lebanese, Jordanian, Palestinian, um, and for me, that's one of the biggest worries for me, and as a diaspora, and almost nearly exclusively diaspora community. If we don't have a cohesive sense of identity, it almost seems as though our time is finite here in the diaspora, because when generations progress, people, or my grandchildren, let's say, may identify less with being Lebanese because it's a bit more of an attenuated um, link or relationship. But Syriacism is still very much who they are because it goes to their essence and their core. Dr. Mutlu, if you could just go ahead and comment on that particular concept and how it kind of manifests in Europe, if it does manifest in Europe.
What I see actually in Europe is, like you said, Armenians are very clear on what they are. And of course, they have a state. So we are stateless diaspora. That means that we don't have a state that gives us this backbone. And what I do notice now is that I remember when I was growing up, people tend to say, I'm Syriac from Turkey or from Syria. That was something that was yeah, mostly said here in Europe. You were either a Suri or a Turi. That's how they mentioned it. And what I also see is that they automatically refer to what village are you from. So they even make that distinction. Like, for example, my people are from Bote. It's a small village. Yours, Richard, are from Midyat, as you said. These are all small villages, and even those distinctions are made. But eventually, what I do think is maybe different from the United States when I look at here in the Netherlands, because we are very concentrated in a certain area, in a region that is called Twente, in this case in the Netherlands. People know who we are, and we live close by. We have many churches in the area, and it's a very small country. So it's not like the United States, and we don't have to like go from west to east. Most Syriacs live in these little towns in the east of Holland, and so that's how also these Dutch people know us better. They know there's a monastery in Glane. They know actually in the nearby towns and villages, they all know about the Syriac Orthodox culture or church because they grow up with kids in their class from when they were young. So I think maybe because it's such a small country and we're really in a small region, like really, how do you say it? Um, really centralized here, that they know more about the Syriacs than when you, for example, go to Amsterdam and you say, I'm Syriac. They will look at you like, are you from Syria? No, I'm not from Syria. I'm from Turkey. Then you're Turkish. So that distinction, that confusion is mostly in the west of the Netherlands. And on the places where, for example, in Södertälje, in Gothenburg, in for example, also places in Germany, I know because there are a lot of Syriacs living there. People know who they are, and it's different from regions where there are like few Syriacs. So
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the key distinctions between European Syriacs and American or North American Syriacs is the fact that in Europe there is a critical mass because there is that concentration as you've described, where in the United States we're a little bit more spread out. So when asked by a coworker or colleague or classmate even, what are you or who are you, we almost shy away from answering Syriac. I feel we sometimes go with what's more mainstream or more easily readily recognizable by saying, oh, Jordanian or Palestinian or Lebanese, and the like, for I guess the desire for maybe acceptance, or maybe just wanting to avoid the question, well, what is that? What does that even mean? Um, so it may be a question of expediency, which I think is very interesting. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Wingert, the link, if there is a link, and this is something I've thought about for some time now, the link between having a clear and sort of acute and firm, I guess, um, identity in the diaspora, and what link and relationship it has, if any, to sort of proceeding as a diaspora that's based in values and moral firmness, let's say. I've been thinking about this idea. I don't know if it's an original idea or if it's out there, but it's something that I kind of have been thinking about, is this idea of moral anonymity. So if I don't know what my identity is per se, if I'm in a position in a diaspora where I'm sort of a chameleon, shifting who I am based on who I'm speaking to, it feels as though this idea of moral anonymity could quickly manifest, whether or not we like it. Just curious, what your thoughts on that would be?
Yeah, it's challenging in a way, because I think before I can even think about a question like that, I have to think about the, I'll call it the game that's being played. Maybe there's a better way to articulate that, but the idea that, you know, one system works in one place and that must work in every place. Like, as Dr. Mutlu was saying, if you go to Amsterdam and you say, that you're from the land that is part of the government of Turkey. Okay, you're Turkish. Well, that has nothing to do with what she's talking about. She's just talking about a location. She's answering where, not who. And so I think part of the issue is with the system itself. And so, I mean, the communities from the Middle East, the Christian communities especially, but also applies to Mesopotamian Jewish communities too. And most are located in the modern state of Israel now, but maybe 50, 70 years ago, this applied to them as well. There's the identity tends to be, as Dr. Mutlu said, more local. Like, well, what village are you from? Are you Hahoyo? Are you Aymornoyo? So those are like just different villages and affiliations that people would identify as. And I remember there's a professor from the community who's an engineering professor at Stanford, and he was telling me one time how his mom was from the neighboring village of their identity, and so she was called Nuhreito, like she was the foreigner, right? That's what the word means. It means she was the foreigner, right? The like foreigner. What are you talking about? It's like a 30-minute walk at most. Like I said walk, and not like a 3 to 5 minute drive or whatever. And because of that, like everything's so insular within a broader community. And so how do we even draw a line around something like that? Because we're trying to explain it for maybe a Western conditioned response, right? If Dr. Mutlu is from, the land in southeast Turkey, the easiest thing for folks in the West, okay, Turkey, Turkish, Syria, Syrian, Iraq, Iraqi, right? Well, okay, maybe there's a passport involved, but like that answers where, not who. And so then the question is, well, what does that, what was your word about the moral framework?
Yeah,
How
moral
do you say it?
anonymity. Yeah.
Like how does something like that even get defined? And can it be defined generally, or is it something that really has its own, local nuances to it? And, maybe these people they have these tendencies, they have these thoughts or these approaches, or they'll do this when you come to visit, right? As a way of greeting the guest and things like that. And I mean, it is for me, it's a tough thing to think about, and based on our common experience here in the U.S., and national gatherings and things like that, it's a big question that exists at those gatherings, right? Like, what are you guys doing? Like, that's not the purpose of this gathering. And then other people like, who are you? Oh, we're related. What? I didn't even know you were here, because you don't come to any of the other, And so, like, what draws the people maybe needs to be thought about. before that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
that's where I would go with.
I think
But
this idea of moral anonymity that I've kind of, again, I don't know if it's an original thought, but certainly one that I've thought up on my own was not. It's not so much a sociological or maybe even not even a scientific, but certainly anecdotal, but I would say true in my observation nonetheless. And simply because where we derive, in my view anyhow, where we derive our values, our principles, our ideas, and for ourselves, families, and community are from the wisdom, the lessons, the experiences of our elders. We're talking about the Sayfo. That's a huge source of, my great grandparents, who I had the pleasure of meeting when I was very young. Didn't really hear their stories of Sayfo, but um, that's where we derive our wisdom, our principles, and what makes us who we are going forward. And I feel as though sometimes if we forget who we are, if we kind of reclassify ourselves based on what's expedient in the West or in Western societies, on what's mainstream, we may sometimes forget or maybe lose to some degree, and varying degrees, I'm sure, from person to person, who we are, which sort of, like, if I'm going to make a bad decision or a decision, good or bad, in the back of my head, to some extent, maybe, is this who I am? Is this what the experiences that were shared with me by my elders might reflect? And if that's in our consciousness somewhere, I think we may be more accountable to ourselves morally, or in terms of virtue. So, and that's, again, I'm not a sociologist by any stretch, but just some musings that I have on the topic that I think there may be something to it. I know, Dr. Mutlu, you probably in your academic work. That you obviously focused on Sayfo, probably worked with some elders, or at least some records of oral histories, oral traditions. And I'm curious, what impact does that have today, in your estimation, on young people, young adults, families, in the Syriac community around the world?
Yeah, indeed. I had the opportunity to use interviews with actual Cypher survivors, because these were recordings that I could collect, and I built from there. I interviewed their children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. So I did like 15 respondents in my research, and what I noticed was very surprising. Actually, I found that even in the younger generations, there were some people that could really uh, tell this narrative of their elders very, very detailed, and even with like details in a Kurdi, because that's what they heard, even though they don't speak Kurdish. And if you would listen to them, you would say they have seen it themselves. So this oral tradition that is passed on actually is still very effective. And what I do notice is that even in the young generation, there's this awareness that because there's still no recognition, and the elders, they died for something, they died to save us and our religion and our culture and everything, that the young generation is still really fighting for recognition here. I see like a revitalization here, that young people really stand up and want to stand for their rights, and they also understand the system better because they're born here and they know about their human rights, their political rights, the way to lobby within the government. So I see really a very, yeah, clear effect of actually the narratives they have heard, maybe from these great grandparents, maybe from their parents, maybe even from Syriac TV or wherever. But I see an enormous effect actually.
And what kind of initiatives and efforts are being taken to preserve and memorialize these accounts? Because right now, to my knowledge, they exist only in an oral tradition. Can you talk us through what's happening, if anything, to save them?
Is that a question to me or?
Yes, sorry, or whoever is
Yeah.
able to jump in.
Actually, I think there are some people recording elderly, but not enough. I see that most people just go about their normal days, and they live their life. And what I notice is now there is a generation that is very old, and that's like the second generation. So these are the children of the Sayfo eyewitnesses. And when I attend funerals, people are like, "Oh, I wish I've recorded my grandfather or my grandmother." They because they're the children of Sayfo survivors, but we never actually talked about it. So I think we there are some people who do, there are some very active people, or sometimes also from organizations, from the church, or people that are investigating, researching. But most families, yeah, they just live their lives here, because you have to have a balance, because you live here now. So it's, you're living in between. You have this background, you have your own history, your family history, but you're also adapted and integrated well into this new society. So people don't think about the Sayfo every day, and they don't take the time to think how valuable it is to record these elderly about these narratives of the Sayfo. So I think we don't do it enough, but the people that do, I would say, like tihe, as you say in Syriac, good that they're doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's an incredibly important initiative to undertake. A similar idea is the fact that here we are over a century after the Sayfo, and it's not just the oral traditions and the stories and experiences that you've been discussing that need some kind of reflection and examination. But if you really think about it, it's been 100 years, over 100 years since the genocide, since we've been expelled from the homelands into other regional countries and also into the West. It seems as though we haven't yet had the opportunity to take a breath and look back and consider, once the dust has settled, and reflect on the lessons, the failures, the decision points, what it was like being a non-Arab people in Arab societies, being Syriac people in Western societies, um, you know, with clear eyes and with the benefit of retrospective 2020 vision, not just on these oral tradition stories that we hear, but on many things, experiences and otherwise. Um, Dr. Wingert, what is the likelihood of that really happening? I mean, here we are a century later, and we look at Sayfo with you know almost with nostalgia, certainly with heartbreak and negative nostalgia, of course, um, and it plays a role for sure. But looking at it with sort of a scientific critical lens, now that the dust has settled, and taking lessons away and distilling those lessons, is that something that's really within the realm of possibility, or would even benefit us at this point?
Maybe benefit isn't, that's kind of a loaded thing because you have to, what are the measurables, like, and what's the actual benefit, and that's something for us to think about. But I think when what was the word you used, not wake up but dust settle, get
Right.
established, kind of that sort of idea. Things change, or things upgrade, they go to the next level when it's not an internal conversation. So actually what you're doing right now, the conversation we're all having for a non-heritage audience, is the groundwork for the next level, because you don't want this to be something that's of interest to the descendants of these tragic events. It's not just about them, it's about everybody. Like, this is about humanity, what it means to be a human. In the Netherlands, Dutch people need to be interested in this. The United States, Americans need to be interested in this. Sweden, Swedes, etc. And so, really connecting with people on the outside, I think, is in making them feel like they have a stake in the game as well, is vital to the growth of a community and its integration into wherever it's going. Because I mean, we talked about immigration earlier, and just, you know, um, people, identity in a general sense, right? Like, well, what happens to immigrants when they come to a new country? When do you become Dutch? When do you become an American? And different countries have different answers for that. Some countries, like, well, you've been living here for, 3 generations, but you're still Lebanese. You're never going to be Kuwaiti, like, and so you don't get a passport, or you don't, like, these little things that different places have different answers. And so, um, what's at stake then for the descendants of people who have left? And that might be a general immigrant question too. And how do these stories, whether they're oral, I mean, we're referring to oral histories, and honestly, those are some of them. Those are the most important because they're the living stories as opposed to the textual stories, which can easily be put on a shelf and not engaged. Right? If it's an oral story, it's an engaged story, and so the stories define the community. Well, you and I know there's a lot of people from the community whose parents or grandparents, they were in a region that was not affected by Sayfo. It's not part of their narrative. It's not part of their history. They may even use, different epithets to speak of themselves, and there's all sorts of different things attached. Again, going back to the idea of the community, in a sense, maybe its defining characteristic is in its locality and in the importance of the locale rather than a broad unifying idea of something. And I think the unifying factors might be more commonalities, right? Be it denomination, be it the dialect of Aramaic that's spoken, the region, or the like which families were allied with whom, and all of these things like go into that setting. But how do you define the greater versus the smaller? And I think um, if we can have those conversations maybe first within the community, and next involve, like exactly what you're doing with the podcast, involve the outside world in it, because just as it's causing us, it's causing the community to think about how they articulate themselves to people who would ask, well, you're from Turkey, how come you're not Turkish, right? Like this question. Maybe the conversation is also going to impact the person asking the question. Like, I never thought of it before that a person coming from a place may have a different answer because they had never been conditioned to think in such a way. And so here we are, by bringing it out to light, right? By letting the dust settle or kicking the dust off our sandals, if we can, um, we are now, and call it an advantage, or we're in an opportune situation to get the neighboring communities around us, wherever we live, in Europe, in Australia, in the United States, North America, to think about the world in a different way as well, right? And so there's that reciprocity between the immigrant and, call it the native, or at least the whatever generation level native dweller is. And I do think it's a benefit in the end, because I think it benefits people, and I think it, just to reiterate, making someone feel they have a stake in the game, right? Like this is a we can't we can't even call it the Armenian genocide. I've always disliked that term, not because it doesn't take into account the Aramaic speaking Christians, or the Pontic Greeks, or the Bulgars, or whoever was there, right? Like it's not about that. It's about making it their thing. That's a thing that's their history. No, this is human history. This is what people do to people. And not only the things that we endure, the cruelties that we endure, but how we survive and how we rise from ashes, right? That's a human story. But like, we shouldn't think of it as belonging to X, Y, or Z people group. It belongs to humanity, and it's of mutual benefit. I would say I need a refill on tea.
Go for it. Yeah, absolutely. Tea is critical, especially as a Syriac joining a Syriac program. Tea is critical.
This is what helps the riff. If I can get a good swig of tea, I will go on a 20-minute riff, and there will be no end in sight.
No, it's all good stuff though. I appreciate that. And I got to say, the question that I posed there, the reason for that question, and I hope it's more than just a pointless intellectual exercise or thought exercise. Really, it comes from the fact that it appears to me, and I think you might agree, that through at least the last century or the last couple centuries of Syriac history, we've been sort of reactive to whatever history has thrown our way. Whether it's the Sayfo, it came to us, and obviously we couldn't foresee it, or maybe we could, but it came upon us. The mass exodus or expulsion, it came upon us, so we reacted to it in a reactive posture. Whatever was thrown at us was reactive. It was never proactive. We were never leaning into anything. And I feel as though that's the same thing, the same way we're dealing with the diaspora, the same way we're approaching the diaspora, in such a way that it's happening to us rather than us managing or controlling or having some effect on it. So it almost seems as though through the centuries we've abdicated the pen that writes our history. And this is not unique to us, of course. This happens, this is world history of all communities and all peoples. But it seems as though now, a century later, being able to look back, as we say, that since the dust has settled, okay, what were the decision points? What were the milestones? How did we take them? How did we respond to them? What could we have done? And the like. An example of this was, shortly after the Sayfo, or I should say during the tail end of the Sayfo, there were thousands of Syriac orphans roaming the streets in Tor Abdin and Urfa and Adiyaman and Adana, Turkey. And they were homeless. They were on the streets. Some were taken into Armenian orphanages, some to French orphanages. And a few people came together in Adana, Turkey, who were transplants from Urfa and Diyarbakir and Tor Abdin. And they put together an orphanage, which we now call Tamim Simkat. It was an orphanage of Syriac orphans. When they did this, they probably, and I don't know that they had foresight necessarily, but okay, this is what we got to do. We have orphans. We need to take care of them. Without the foresight that in the decades that followed, this orphanage produced some of the greatest luminaries, I would say, in modern Syriac history: journalists, philosophers, theorists, artists, and other such figures in our community. So something like that happened. A positive thing happened, not necessarily with foresight, but it happened, and here we are, decades later, having reaped the fruits. But there are many examples of that where whether it's the migration and where we went to, how we dealt with it, how we establish social infrastructure to preserve ourselves and to perpetuate our identity and culture and customs and so forth. So it's things like this. Dr. Mutlu, I wanted to ask you on the same idea. What happened in the wake of the genocide, whether it's the founding of the orphanage in Adana or anything else that came after that. Was there anything in your academic work that showed some kind of purposeful, methodical initiative that was by design rather than just an accident of history that we can kind of point to and use as an example?
Well, I think what I've studied, in my case, it was a specific village that I studied. And what I did notice is that the church leaders, they had this role, they took this role to indeed find the orphanage, find the orphans within the region, bring them back, sometimes buying them back. And they didn't stop. So I think they were very aware of the fact that they had to collect the ones that were left there because they wanted to remain a people. And if they would be scattered, for example, all these kids that were kidnapped and were living as Muslims because they were forced to become Muslims, if they wouldn't be taken back to their home village, then they would be just Muslims, and our population would be very small. So I did see a numerous of mostly men. Of course, they had this position to do so because women in that region in that time, it would be very difficult to go from village to village finding children that were Christians. So yes, they I think they were very wise and they had a foreseeing eye of if they would not do this, they would die out. They would become so small that there wasn't any people left. So I think that they did that in an early stage. But later on, I think their situation, at least what I know from in Turkey, it was very difficult. So they still, until today, they don't have the rights as a normal Turk to live free and happily as we live right now in the Western countries. So what I see now is that our diaspora is very active, and that is because we have the luxury of fighting for our people. And we don't have to fear that today we will be attacked because of our religion right now in my country or in yours. So that's why we have the time, the luxury to invest in certain things and to have this foreseeing eye to think about the future and what we want for our children and how we want to preserve our culture, our language, our religion. And we do this, of course, also very good within the church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, and also the other churches. We still teach our children our language. We still make sure that they are active in church and they this way, they really preserve their culture in a very rich way. So I think, yeah, we're doing actually better than expected, maybe. I think our forefathers, when they came to Europe, or they immigrated to America, they assumed after a couple of generations no one could speak the language or no one would attend to church. We'll be all just very too well adapted. But when I look at my, at least in Hengelo where I live, I see this enormous amount of children really going back to church and going back to Sunday class, the madrasa, learning their language. And actually, even my own children, I told them we had to start the Great Lent. And I said, maybe we can try, the first week and the last week. And my son, he's 7 years old, and he said, no, we have to do exactly 48 days. So it's not 50, but it's 48, Mom. I learned this in Sunday school at church, and we're going to do this. And I was really impressed by how he knows this, and how,
Well,
how
good.
he really wants to do this.
I mean, your son's incredible. Just hearing that fact alone. But and I got to tell you, part of that credit, as you say, goes to Sunday school, but a big part of that credit goes to mom and dad. So thank you for being that in your son's life and your children's life, because that's critical. I mean, we talk about these big universal questions of the community, the nation, but really it starts with the parents. It starts at
At
home,
home.
and I
Totally.
think you've just demonstrated the perfect example for that. Um, so yeah, thank you for that. Um, Before we close, I just want to go ahead and kick it over to each of you actually, and hear from you on what you believe to be the greatest challenge and greatest opportunity facing the diaspora communities. Now that we are 100 years, over 100 years after the Sayfo, looking ahead um, as we progress through history. We can start with you, Dr. Wingert.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
Good.
it properly. Can you repeat the question?
Certainly, yeah. No, I just wanted to hear from you before we wrap up what each of you believe to be the greatest challenge and greatest opportunity for the diaspora community, the Syriac diaspora community, now that we're a century after the Sayfo looking ahead. So we can start with Dr. Wingert.
Well, I think he's starting with me because like I'm the bitter pill, and then Dr. Mutlu, you can give the sweeter, kinder interpretation about it, and we'll end on a high note. But I think the greatest challenge for the community, in my observation, has been the culture of low expectations of the entire community. The common refrain is, "Well, you know our people." What? I do know your people. And it's been used as an excuse not to learn things, not to do 48 days and instead do the first and last week, right? Well, you know our people. They're not going to do there. You know our people. No, I know that sounds like a lame excuse. And because I know saintly people, like saints in the community, and I know people who aren't. And that's just like any community, of course, right? But by having a low expectation, by not wanting to maybe learn a little more, or diversify your experience, whether it's inside or outside, of community interests. And that could be, I mean, we're talking about education, but also participation in communal events, and some of those may be local, some may be national. What defines a people? Like that's a question anthropologists and sociologists ask all the time. And so, is it food? Is it language? Whose version of the language? Because that's one reason people like to you know what's a nice way to say, argue, have fun discussions over tea and backgammon. Is, do you say kaiso or toho? And so, like, what's the word for good? Oh, you're from the town, you're from the village, right? Like, okay, guess what? It's okay to learn both words. Whatever the root of one word is versus the other, it doesn't matter. People use words that are proper to the history and others that are more recent. Maybe they're 100 years old, and you know, uh, a Kurdish person brought a beautiful bag one time, and they called it a chanta, and now everyone calls it a chanta instead of the normal Aramaic word for it, right? But like, but that's part of the language, and it's okay to learn more, and it's okay to study more, it's okay to engage more, it's okay to volunteer more, it's okay to step up and get up early or on time, right? Like, for those who are listening, there's a notorious habit of coming late to things, but that has to do with the idea of a start time, right? Like, in the Western setting, especially kind of the Germanic Anglo-Saxon tradition, like the time is when it begins, the assigned time, versus for the and there are words for this in the Semitic languages, for the appropriate time. And the appropriate time is like once everyone is there, and that's when things start. And so the time on an invitation might be, and that might be the invitation to come, and that's when the doors open, people start to arrive, and not actual the beginning. The beginning is when everyone's there, right? But it's understanding, so those little differences and things. Well, okay, if you're dealing with a Western context, it's okay to come on time. If you're dealing with a Middle Eastern context, it's okay to come when everyone's there, and understand the two, and not be so hard and fast one or the other, but be open. And there's a lot of opportunity for that. I mean, I think a large part of our talk was on the opportunities, that are present. And if people can um, not make excuses, I think that's a big one. If there's a person there who's willing to teach you the language, and you, not Rich, of course, or Dr. Mutlu, but if one had been saying, okay, well, isn't it a shame we don't know the language anymore? Isn't it a shame? Oh, hey, these guys, they just moved here, and he's a teacher, actually, and he's willing to hold courses. Yeah, what time's the Laker game on? And the immediate shift, right? Like, being open to being happy with things that are different, maybe hard. Look, to be fair, something like language learning is hard, right? And no one expects everyone to memorize the history, or the oral recension of Sayfo, or whatever. Like, just know that everyone can do something, and getting through that is the challenge, right? You get through that realization that, okay, maybe I haven't put out the best effort, and I could. What would that look like? Because it's a force multiplier. It's going to have effects beyond just one person doing something, and they will eventually aggregate into the next generation, where Dr. Mutlu's kids are like, "Mom, how dare you fast first and last week? What a slacker! It's supposed to be. This is the length of the fast. We fast, the Lent, the Great Lent, and then we fast the Holy Week, and we have a day in between." And like, they go through it, and like, now something has happened where that person, in this case a child, has been activated, right? So how did Dr. Butler herself react to that unexpected joy, right? That unexpected, like, wow, like, I didn't teach you to do that, but like, now maybe she's motivated in a certain way, and then, like, as people start all doing it piece by piece, you see a revival of community. And so with the challenge is the opportunity, right?
Okay, yeah, that's a wonderful way to look at it, because unless there is a challenge, opportunities aren't necessarily implemented, because they are in response to challenges. So that makes perfect sense. Dr. Mutlu, I'd love to hear from you your thoughts on opportunities and challenges following Sayfo, but looking ahead.
Indeed, I want to add on what Michael is saying, or Dr. Wingert, I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
What I do notice, what you mentioned about, our people, I do remember that growing up. That was something I heard a lot. But when I look at our community today, I see many people are very proud, actually. So maybe we're a little bit more ahead here. I don't know. But I see that the community is more proud of each other, and more like, okay, we're still alive, actually, and we're still doing well. We're proud of our children. Look at the church. It's filled with hundreds of kids really doing well, and they speak the language, and they're becoming shamoshe, and we're doing actually good. So I see a switch there. So I think indeed that challenge was here as well, and we acted upon the challenge, and now we're growing there. So I think that's very positive. Um,
I think that's a
and
great thing, Dr. Mutlu. But I want to ask you: have you had the chance to visit the United States?
no, I haven't. I
I can,
visited
I
once,
can tell.
but I didn't go to church,
Sayfo.
or I just went New York site visiting. And
Well, I love what you have to say though, because this is actually news to me. What you said about that pride, that surge of pride of the fact that, hey, we're still here a century later. That's wonderful. Sorry to cut you off.
no,
Please
no
go ahead.
problem at all. What I also notice is that we are understanding that we're actually doing very well here. So economically, but also when it comes to education, we're doing even mostly better than the locals, the natives. So that also becomes very interesting here. We see a lot of kids graduating very, very good, and also in universities, but we see it with the little kids as well. They're, most of them are at top of the class. So I really see an enormous growth here. So I think, well, the positive thing is our future has a really, or our children, our next generation, they have a really bright future. I think there's a good balance still after so many years. There's a balance of adapting, adjusting here, doing well in this system, and making sure you survive here, but they still see themselves as Syrioye. They see themselves as Syriac, and they live in both worlds actually, and they can combine this balance. So I think that's very positive. The only challenge I still see is when it comes to the Sayfo and the recognition, that is still difficult because we're a stateless diaspora. Everyone does something. So we're on all different islands, really trying to achieve the same thing, but I still miss the connection when whether it is worldwide or within my own country. I think if we would combine all the efforts and all the strengths, we would be further in our recognition struggle. So I think that's still a challenge, but I hope that in the future all boundaries will fall away, and that we can work very good together to make sure that we get what we want and what we deserve.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really happy to hear your report on the status of our community in Europe, specifically in the Netherlands. And I couldn't agree with you more on the challenge of having that unified voice, having that cohesive message, because we're all saying the same thing, but in slightly different ways and with slightly different tones and so on and so forth. But yeah, unification is critical. For me, I think the challenge and opportunity, kind of as Dr. Wingert was saying, are almost one and the same. And for me, it comes down to one word. And of course, that's an oversimplification, but we can distill it down to one word, and that is intentionality. Intentionality. So we need to be, in my opinion, in my view, as a diaspora going forward, intentional in how we approach things. As we kind of discussed, history kind of came upon us and the negative effects of history. And we sort of took them in a reactive posture, never leaned in, never really was able to control what was coming our way. But looking at the diaspora, we can be intentional in how we raise our children. We can be intentional in what we do with our language. We can be intentional in how we perceive our identity and who we are and how we fit into the greater tableau and the greater picture in Western society. We can be more intentional in how we plan and organize our society locally and universally. So for me, that's what it comes to. Stop being victims. No doubt we were victims of a genocide, but we don't need to be victims of ourselves or of history. And I think that's where intentionality really plays its role. So that's really my 2 cents on the issue. But I thank you both, really thank you both from the bottom of my heart for joining me to discuss this topic that really means so much to all of us. It's one that's left a mark on our people and will continue to do so. But it's on us to sort of take it where it will lead us and where we want it to lead us in the century to come. So once again, thank you, Malfono Mike, Malfonito Sofia. I'm going to call you by your Syriac title for professor or teacher. Thank you for joining me, Todi Sagi. And I wish you both a great day. Thank you.
Thank
لو
you.
مدينة هذه غالبا
Tell the Sagi. Push back Shlomo.